Good afternoon, Parnell School. Welcome to my story today, and I'm going to read to you a story called The Bantam and the Soldier. And it is written by Jennifer Beck and Robin Belton. And it's a story that's set in the midst of fighting and devastation and an unusual friendship that is formed between a soldier and, I won't tell you and spoil the surprise, but you'll be able to make the connections. So get comfortable. It's a longer story than yesterday, and enjoy. On the outskirts of a village in France, an elderly farmer kept a flock of bantams in his barn. Among them was one young bantam who was sometimes picked by the others. Food was scarce. Now that's a word you might not know, so you might need to ask someone, or you could use a dictionary to find out what the word scarce means. And they would not always let her share the grain the farmer threw them. It was wartime. The old stone barn echoed to the sounds of heavy tanks rolling past, and to the beat of soldiers' boots as regiment after regiment marched towards the battlefield just over the hill. And you may not know what regiment is either. It's not a word we hear very often, so that might be another word that you could have a look, see if you could find the meaning. The rattle of machine gun fire and the flash of shells exploding in the distance had been part of the bantam's life from the beginning. She had grown used to the sound of war. She was more afraid of the sharp pecks and the claws of some of her barnyard companions. The battle spread towards the village, with the smell of gunpowder beginning to drift across the farmyard. The farmer herded together his best animals and prepared to drive them to a safer land further south, as he did not have enough room for the bantams. The farmer opened the barn door and left them to fend for themselves. What do you think the word fend means? There's the little bantam hen. Just see her there. And the farmers opened the barn door and left the animals to fend for themselves. The bantams fossicked in the farmyard during the day and returned to the barn to roost in the evening. That is, all except the smallest bantam. She kept apart from the others, foraging in the nearby fields and sleeping at night under the overgrown hedge by the roadside. What do you think that word foraging might mean? What do you think the bantam is doing? If she's having to fend for herself, what do you think she might be doing? One night there was a deafening explosion. A stray shell landed near the farmyard. The barn collapsed into a heap of broken beams and jumbled stones. There was silence. Only the bantam under the hedge survived, but in the blast she was thrown amongst the branches, and she could not struggle free. So there was a big explosion, and she was thrown under the hedge. It happened that the next morning a company of soldiers marched through the village towards the battlefield. They had come from a country on the other side of the world to join their allies. In those days they called it the Great War, and they believed it was the war that would end all wars. The soldiers had been marching for many hours. There were sighs of relief when they were allowed to rest for a while by the roadside. One of the youngest farmers amongst them was a farmer called Arthur. He loved farm life, and until a year before had travelled no further than 100 miles from home. In war-torn Europe he often felt homesick and afraid, but tried not to show it. The other soldiers often teased him as he was shy and he had his country ways. Sitting slightly apart from the others, Arthur took out a postcard to send to his family back home. He was thinking about his young niece, who liked to visit the farm during the school holidays. Arthur had just written, "Give my love to Bertha," when he saw a movement in the hedge. It was the bantam, trapped between the branches, and by then she was too weak to make a sound. And there you can just see Arthur looking behind him and sort of make out the shadow of the bantam. "Take it easy, little one," Arthur whispered as he cradled the quivering bird in his hands and eased her gently through the tangle of the thorns. Just then the officer in charge shouted, "Time's up, men!" and the soldiers struggled reluctantly to their feet and began to line up on the road. "Hurry up there," the officers ordered when he noticed Arthur standing facing the hedge. What was Arthur to do? Hastily, he unbuttoned his thick khaki uniform and slipped the little bantam inside his jacket. Why do you think he would have slipped the little bantam hen inside his jacket? What was he trying to do? That evening, Arthur fed the bantam some food that he'd saved. The other soldiers shook their heads and just laughed at him. "What's the use of keeping that miserable-looking bird?" one of them demanded. "It's so scrawny, it wouldn't even make a decent bowl of soup." "If it starts crowing in the middle of the night, I'll wring its skinny little neck," warned another. "Her name is Bertha," replied Arthur, "and she needs someone to look after her." So Arthur's showing some kindness. He wants to look after Bertha because he's used to farm life, and the other soldiers just are making a bit of fun of him. What do you think Arthur should do? At first, life in the trenches was not so bad. Arthur was able to share his food with Bertha, and she grew stronger. The soldiers stopped teasing Arthur and began to look upon Bertha as a lucky mascot. They even helped him build a pen for her. So they're being a little bit kinder. You can just see them making a little pen for her, a little shelter for her in the trenches. But the fighting grew very heavy. Food became scarce, and Arthur and his companions collected grubs and worms for Bertha from the muddy banks of their clay prison. And she rewarded them. In the midst of the raging battle, when the sky was crisscrossed with fire, Bertha laid a warm brown egg. When Arthur found it, he hugged the little bantam to his mud-caked jacket. And that was a nice surprise, wasn't it? Because they're in the middle of a war zone, and they don't have anything fresh. They would have had, as you know, dried biscuits, which we now call Anzac biscuits, and dried food, but food would have been very hard to come by, so a fresh egg would have been a bit of a treat. Every morning from then on, as regular as daybreak, Bertha laid an egg for Arthur and his friends. They shared the eggs, a treat for those who were most in need. During the terrible weeks that followed, the bantam gave them something to joke about. "A hen in the trench is worth 5 on the farm," they'd say, or "an egg a day keeps the shell shock away." Above all, Bertha gave these soldiers courage and hope. "If a bantam can live through this, and lay eggs as well," they told one another, "then perhaps we can survive this terrible war." It's not a very pretty sight. You can see all the barbed wire up on the hill, and the guns in the trenches are a bit grim. So the little hen is brightening their lives a little bit. Something to look forward to when she lays an egg for them. At last the battle moved north, and the fighting began to draw to an end. Arthur and his remaining companions were able to clamber out of the waterlogged trenches and make their way back towards the camp, across the mile or so of territory that they had won. And there's all the soldiers walking across, and you can see their reflections in the water there. That's a pretty sombre sight. What do you think I mean by sombre? When the soldiers had begun to recover their strength and it was time to leave, they pleaded to be allowed to take Bertha home with them. "Sorry," replied the officer, "we're a long way from home. You must leave her here." And she'd become a friend, and they didn't want to leave her behind. But war was nearly over, and they couldn't take her back home with them. A few days later, those who were left of Arthur's regiment once again marched past the farmyard. The farmer had returned and was unloading his cart. Bertha had grown and was now able to look after herself. Arthur lifted the bantam out from under his jacket, and each of his comrades, in turn, said goodbye to her. Now there's a word. What do you think the word comrade means? Arthur was last. He whispered, "Thank you, Bertha. May you now live in freedom and peace." And he gently sat her down among the poppies that grew in the field beside the hedge. And the poppies are a symbol of wartime. That's why we have poppies today. See the lovely red coloured poppies in the corner there? Many months later, the soldiers left Europe on troop ship for home. When they finally sailed into the harbour, the wharf was crowded with people waiting to welcome them. Arthur's family hardly recognised the tall soldier being farewelled by his friends. There he is, ready to go with his pack and his bedroll, and his family are running to welcome him home and hear all about the stories of war. Arthur returned to the farm, and once again his niece Bertha went to visit him during the school holidays. A flock of bantams now foraged in the yard. Arthur showed Bertha how to feed and care for them, and soon they followed her everywhere. Arthur never did talk much about the war, but one day he said to his niece, "I want to tell you a story." And what do you think he's going to tell her a story about? Maybe it could be about the little bantam that he befriended while he was at war. What do you think? And the story was about a bantam called Bertha. So that was a really interesting story with lots of probably new words, but I'd like you to have a little think. There's some words that you may not have heard of before, and I want you to have a little think. So maybe you could do a little bit of research and find out, what does scarce mean? What does the word regiment mean? What does the word fosset mean, when the little bantam hen was fossicking around for something to eat? The word companions, the word foraging, and lucky mascot. So there's a few words that I'd like you to have a little think about. And that story, The Bantam and the Soldier,